many moments like this one, the change we need doesn't come from Washington, change comes to Washington. Change happens because the American people demand it, because they rise up, because they insist on new ideas and new leadership and a new politics at a new time. That's what we need. Because the same old is not going to cut it. Said America, this is one of these moments. I believe that as hard as it would be, the change that we need is coming because I've seen it. He's seen it. He has lived that change. And he truly has. He is an international brother. Born and raised in Hawaii, moved to Indonesia when his mother remarried, came back to Hawaii for high school, and then went to college in LA, and then transferred to New York, and then came to Chicago, and then came to New York, and then went back to Chicago. So this is a brother who has always been around us. He has not left his community, even though he had the chance to do so many, many times. Then he went on to talk about the promise of America. He says, this country of ours has more wealth than any nation, but that is not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military on earth, but that is not what makes us strong. Instead, it is that American spirit, that American promise that pushes us forward even when the path is uncertain, that binds us together in spite of our differences, that makes us fix our eyes on what is unseen. But what is unseen is that far better place around the thing. He's talking about a vision. He ain't talking about a dream. He's talking about a vision. And as we all know, in order to do anything, you must first have a vision in your mind. And you must have the skills to manifest that vision. He said this promise is our greatest inheritance. And it is this promise that 45 years ago today brought Americans from every corner of the land to stand together on the mall in Washington, D.C. before Lincoln's Memorial to hear a young preacher from Georgia speak of his dream. We cannot walk alone, the preacher cried. And as we walk, we must take the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We shall never turn back. Now, Barack delivered this speech in a football stadium before a crowd of 80,000 people. That's history. Nobody in the history of presidential politics has ever done that. He moved the world with that speech. So we can't just look at him in the context of a black man speaking here in the United States. This is a black man speaking to the world which he has been a part of all of his life. And even mean-spirited Pat Buchanan had to acknowledge that Barack's speech was the greatest speech that at any political event by a presidential nominee. Even mean-spirited Pat Buchanan was moved by that message. Now, yeah, it's a lot of movement. Now, I got to be honest with you. As I watched the speech on television, I hung on his every word because I wanted Barack to do well because I knew he was representing us before the eyes of the world. But as I heard Barack talk about America and the economy and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as I heard him talk about homosexuals, and I heard him talk about Israel, I found myself feeling like Jennifer Hudson in Dreamgirls. You know that scene in Dreamgirls when Curtis' manager is about to push her to the back and put Beyonce up front? And she said, but what about me? But what about, I was waiting to hear him say something about us. I was waiting. But Barack, very skillfully and in code, made two references to a young preacher from Georgia who spoke of his dream 45 years ago that day. Now, the truth of the matter is, as we analyze his speech, we realize that he saved the best for last. He didn't have to mention King's name because everybody knew what day that was. Everybody knew the significance of Dr. King's accomplishment. So he didn't have to say his name. Just reference him. And symbolically, that reference would draw you to that particular moment in time. He's talking in code. Now, Eugene Robinson, a black reporter for the Washington Post, summed up this moment. Now, I want you to hear his analysis of that speech at that particular moment. He said that I haven't heard much about race during the Democratic National Convention, and that was clearly by design. And in terms of Obama's prospects, it was probably a good thing. A recent New York Times CBS poll found that 16% of white voters feared an Obama administration would favor blacks over whites. Obama has taken great pains to reassure voters that as president he would act without racial animus or resentment, and that he bears no grudges and intends to settle no scores. His success to date has depended largely on his ability to be seen as a candidate who happens to be black rather than a black candidate. Right? Now, understand the truth of that. Understand where we live, in a racist country. If he came out and said what he really wanted to do, he would not have gotten as far as he had. Whites have always feared, after the end of slavery, after the end of colonization, after the end of apartheid, after the era of Jim Crow, white folk have always feared that we would do to them what they have done to us. But that's not in us. That's not our spirit. We have never aggressed against them like they have aggressed against us. But because of our miseducation, let's understand that. We aggress against ourselves. Yes. We aggress against ourselves because of that internalized racism, because of that internalized hatred. The key is, it took me a long time to really understand this and to resonate with what Dr. King's message was, that you can't harbor hate. If you really understand the process, the power and the emotions of love and hate. Hate destroys. The person who harbors hatred more than it destroys the object of your hatred. If you understand the power of the mind, the power of thought and consciousness, it's better to be neutral and indifferent than to hate. Because that hatred destroys you. That is why we are destroying ourselves, sisters and brothers. That's why we kill each other, attack each other physically or verbally. That's why we kill ourselves with the poisons that we feel put in our bodies. Because of this hatred that we have not learned to neutralize. Because we have not learned to love ourselves. Because when people love themselves, they talk differently to each other. They treat each other differently. They don't accept unacceptable behavior in their community. So there are lessons that we have to learn. So if we are to heal ourselves, we need to begin to understand my final point. The final point that Barack talked about, it's not about me, it's about you. We have to begin to understand the role that we must play in this upcoming presidential election and beyond. Because it doesn't stop with this election. It doesn't stop with you registering to vote. It doesn't stop with you voting. That's just the beginning. We have to begin to galvanize ourselves, to mobilize ourselves, to do the things that we did 50 years ago, before we had the right to vote, before integration. We worked together as a people, but we lost all of that simply because we had the opportunity to live next to white folk, to work with white folk, to go to school with white folk, as if that was going to solve our problem. So we have to begin to realize that there's an aphorism, that all is fair in love and war. And if we've learned anything about the last 18 to 20 months of this presidential campaign, it's been that Americans love politics. And that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are hot political issues. History teaches us that every war is political. That wars are started by politicians, usually old white men. Every war has social ramifications that affects generations of people. So I would like to modify my aforementioned aphorism on the basis of my analysis and suggest that all is fair in love, war, and politics. Okay? So let's define these terms so that we can be clear about what they mean to us and their impact on our lives. Webster defines love as an intense feeling of affection and compassion for a person or an object. The National War College in Washington, D.C. defines war as organized chaos. War is defined as organized chaos. Politicians and war strategists are very clear that the first battle in any war takes place in the mind, and the first casualty of war is the truth. Yeah. Politics exerts such a powerful force over our lives. It can generate intense feelings of love and hatred, and has domination over everyone on a local, state, and a national level. So, what is politics? And how can we use this power to improve our lives and to benefit mankind? Politics is defined as the theory and practice of forming and running organizations connected with the government. Another definition says that politics is the activity within a political party or organization that is concerned with debate and the creation and carrying out of distinctive policies. And the third working definition is politics is the use of tactics and strategies to gain power over a group or an organization. Politics and power go together like hand and glove, and both are oftentimes abused. Those in power have a tendency to look after their own, often at the expense of their opponents and the disenfranchised. And it brings to mind the old saying that when two elephants fight, or in this instance, when an elephant and a donkey fight, it is the grass that suffers. And those who suffer tend to look at politics and politicians in an unfavorable light. For example, one disgruntled voter said that a politician is one who serves God in such a manner as not to offend the devil. So Charles Hamilton Houston, a powerful brother, powerful attorney, Charles Hamilton Houston provided us with another definition, another option for examining politicians. He said that a politician is either a social engineer or a parasite. And so I think to a large extent, those social engineers who can introduce and implement policies that change the course of people's lives in a favorable direction move beyond the definition of politics. They become statesmen, stateswomen.